It's important when you're considering pebbles that you consider the grade, the colour options, and really what you're actually trying to achieve on whatever the job is. So most people will use pebbles either for pathway or a driveway, or for something a little bit unusual like this, which is a semi-beachfront in a beautiful Japanese garden. Some will have them on pots, so it just sort of depends what your project is as to what colour and particularly what grade you use. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time here on the grades. They're all available on the website. In basic terms, you will get a 10 mil, a 20 mil and a 30 to 40 mil. They're the common grades, but that's that's something we can go through later on. This is really about giving you an idea of the colour options and where you would use them. Now, the most common pebble will be a river pebble. Now, the river pebbles will depend obviously on where the river is that you get them from, so the colours can change a bit. They tend to be greys, they tend to be fawns, a little bit of white, so they're a bit of a mixture. They would be the most economical pebble you can buy. Used quite a lot in things like native pathways and driveways, things like that. They're a rounded pebble. This is actually quite a small, this is a 10 mil, but it's quite a small 10 mil. But you can see that's the sort of colour palette. You might get some more reds in there, it just depends where the river gravel comes from. So it's a good idea to get the gravel and have a look at it, wash it off and have a look at it before you make your choice. There's then a series of whites. What we have here is a 30 to 40 mil western white. It's used in this instance because it's heavy, it's large, it's right near the water and they don't want it to move. It's also used, that grade's also used in rooftop gardens a bit for the same reason. They're windy, it's quite dense obviously, and it sits there and won't move. So in windy exposed environments, and this is a bit exposed here as well, that's a good grade. So that's a 30 to 40 mil. You also get it in a 10 and a 20 mil obviously. Now what you'll find is you'll get little bits of yellow, little bits of tan, little bits of flecks of grey in there. So it's not a pure white. It's also a rounded pebble. So if you're going to use pebbles like this, just be careful about the grade or the slope they're on. Rounded pebbles tend to roll. So think about whether or not there's going to be water running over it, or is it a flat surface or not. If it's a flat surface, a round is fine. Also, if it's too large like this, it's difficult to walk on, so that's something you want to keep in mind as well. If things like that, if there's a bit of a slope, if the movement of the pebble bothers you, then you can go to something like a salt and pepper. Now, this is a 20 mil grade salt and pepper. This is actually a crushed aggregate, it's a crushed pebble. So the difference between that, obviously, that's how it's quarried. That's a round pebble, how it's quarried. This is rock that's been crushed. The advantage of a crushed aggregate is it tends not to move. Obviously, of course, it's got flat surfaces and it tends to sit in place. So it's a more stable aggregate in situations on driveways or on pathways where you think the aggregate's going to move with, car tyres screwing on it and things like that. It's obviously not a pure white, so you get flecks of greys, and often that's a good thing because a pure white can be pretty stark when the sun's on it. So again, it depends what sort of look you're trying to achieve. You can then go to a crushed white. Now you can see that's quite a stark white, and in relatively small amounts, like on the top of pots and things like that, it's very effective. Obviously a good contrast to the sort of the foliage like you can see around here, but it can be pretty stark. So just keep that in mind. It can be glary, so in a big pathway or a big driveway, that can be off-putting. If it's shaded, no problems, but it is something to think about. You then go to a wild honey, what we call a wild honey. This sample's a little bit wet, so some of that grayness will disappear when it's drier. It's got, I guess, some honey tones through it. So it's not a stark white. This is also a crushed aggregate, so again, it's good for pathways and driveways. And it's a nice tone without being too bright and glary. So often people will go for this instead of one of the whites. Again, it depends on the colour of your house and the aesthetics and the tones you're looking for, but that's a good option for a relatively light aggregate, or decorative gravel, that's not stark, but it is light, so it, again, depends on the tones you're looking for. Once again, forget the grades of these. These are mainly 10s and 20 mils I've got here, so there's a 10, a 20, and a 30 to 40. And depending where the quarries are and how they grade, it's not an exact 10 or exact 20 or an exact 30 to 40. They are nominal grades, if you like, so they can be slightly bigger or smaller. The next colour is Western Gold. Obviously very yellow, rusty coloured, got some irons in it. Probably less common now than it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago when this colour was sort of quite common in housing and landscape. It's a nice contrast though. Again, often used in pots, you know, as a contrast in pots. Depends the aesthetics of the place. Not as popular as it used to be, but it's an unusual colour which often suits someone's needs. Last one, and look, you can see this one's not quite clean. This is Riverina Red. Now this is a 10 to 14 mil Riverina Red. It's probably mainly used in Federation style housing. So of that era, it was very common to have a red driveway or pathway. Not so common in other applications, but perfect for those. So again, you can't really see the tones. Obviously it's a red, can be rusty, sort of quite rusty coloured. There's a little flecks of light in it, but it's very much a red rusty tone. Perfect for Federation houses. So you know, keep that in mind for those sorts of jobs. And that really covers the main tones. There are things like scorias and other things, but in terms of aggregates or decorative gravel, sorry, for roadways, for driveways and pathways, this is the range to look for.